Congress just delivered what may be the most underreported Second Amendment victory in decades. While most headlines are framing it as a minor tax adjustment or a symbolic concession, the reality is far more consequential. Lawmakers have moved to block the expansion of the Suppressor and Short-Barreled Rifle Tax Registry, effectively stopping the federal government from continuing to grow one of the most detailed firearms databases it has ever maintained. And if that sounds technical or boring, it shouldn't, because this decision doesn't just affect how much money gun owners pay, it affects how much power the federal government can accumulate over time. To understand why this matters, you first have to understand what was actually stopped. For decades, suppressors and short-barreled rifles have been regulated under the National Firearms Act. Every purchase requires a tax payment, a lengthy approval process, and the submission of personal identifying information that goes far beyond what's required for a standard firearm purchase. That information doesn't disappear after approval. It is permanently stored in a federal registry that grows larger every single year. The common assumption has always been that the tax is the primary burden, $200 per item. Annoying, sure, but manageable for many buyers. That framing is convenient because it keeps the conversation focused on money instead of data. What Congress has now interrupted is not just a tax mechanism, but the automatic expansion of a centralized registry that links specific firearms accessories to specific individuals, addresses, and biometric identifiers. The federal government already maintains the National Firearms Registration and Transfer Record, a database that contains millions of entries accumulated over nearly a century. Each new suppressor or SBR added under the tax system increases the size, accuracy, and usefulness of that database. What Congress has done is cut off the growth trajectory. That matters because registries derive their power from scale. A small registry is inconvenient. A large registry becomes a policy weapon. This is why the reaction from gun control organizations has been so intense, even while public messaging downplays the significance. The registry was on track to expand rapidly over the next decade. Suppressor ownership has surged in recent years as more Americans view them not as exotic military tools, but as basic safety equipment. Hearing protection, recoil management, reduced noise complaints, these are practical concerns, not ideological ones. And every new buyer entering the system meant another permanent record tied to federal oversight. By stopping the tax registry growth, Congress has disrupted that momentum. The government can no longer rely on future purchases to steadily increase the completeness of its records. That alone reshapes the political landscape. Registries are most powerful when they are comprehensive. Once coverage becomes partial, their enforcement value drops dramatically. There's also a timing factor that makes this moment especially important. Over the last 15 years, suppressor registrations have grown at an accelerating pace. The federal database has been expanding faster recently than at any other point since the NFA was enacted. That trend suggested a future where millions more gun owners would be permanently cataloged under a system originally designed in the 1930s. Congress stepping in now stops that expansion before it reaches critical mass. This decision also reveals something important about priorities. If this were really about revenue, lawmakers would not have targeted the registry mechanism itself. The revenue generated from suppressors and SBRs represents a tiny fraction of federal enforcement budgets. It is statistically irrelevant to agency funding. What matters is the information collected alongside the payment. By halting registry growth, Congress has acknowledged, implicitly if not publicly, that data accumulation, not revenue, is the true leverage point. Critics argue that nothing meaningful has changed because existing registrations remain in place. That's true, but it misses the larger picture. Registries don't need to disappear overnight to lose power. They lose power when they stop growing. Every year that passes without new entries dilutes their relevance. The government can only regulate what it can reliably identify. Once new items enter circulation without being recorded, the database becomes increasingly incomplete. and incompleteness changes everything. Enforcement becomes selective, policy proposals become harder to justify, courts become more skeptical of regulations based on outdated or partial data. A registry that captures most items is a foundation for control. A registry that captures a shrinking percentage of items becomes an administrative relic. You cannot rewind history, but you can stop feeding the machine. Congress has effectively closed the intake valve. Over time, that single decision alters the balance of power in ways that are difficult to reverse. There's also a cultural shift happening underneath the policy debate. Suppressors and SBRs are no longer fringe items owned by a small niche of enthusiasts. They are increasingly common among ordinary gun owners. As ownership normalizes, the justification for exceptional regulation weakens. Freezing the registry at its current size locks in an outdated picture of who owns what and why. This move also sends a signal to manufacturers and consumers alike. It reduces uncertainty, it lowers barriers to entry, and it changes expectations about the future of firearms regulation. When people believe that ownership will automatically place them on a permanent federal list, many choose not to participate at all. Removing that assumption encourages lawful participation without expanding surveillance. None of this guarantees smooth sailing ahead. States will respond, advocacy groups will regroup, legal challenges are inevitable, but the direction of travel has changed. For the first time in decades, the Suppressor and SBR regulatory framework is no longer on autopilot expansion. And that's the key takeaway here. Congress didn't just pause attacks, it interrupted a long-running data collection process that depended on inertia and public misunderstanding to keep growing. Whether lawmakers intended to or not, they have shifted the conversation away from cost and toward control. And once that shift happens, it becomes much harder to put the genie back in the bottle. To understand why stopping registry growth matters more than deleting a registry outright, you have to understand how regulatory power actually works in practice. Governments don't rely on laws alone. They rely on visibility. The ability to see, quantify, and map ownership is what turns legislation from words on paper into enforceable reality. When visibility declines, enforcement becomes speculative, and speculative enforcement is where political ambition usually stalls. A firearms registry is only as powerful as its coverage. When a database captures the vast majority of items in circulation, policymakers can speak confidently about universal compliance and comprehensive oversight. But once that same database starts missing a growing share of items, its authority erodes. You can't credibly regulate what you can't reliably measure. This is the inflection point Congress has forced. By stopping Suppressor and SBR tax registry growth, lawmakers didn't eliminate the existing records, but they did something far more disruptive. They froze the system in time. From this moment forward, every year that passes without mandatory registration reduces the registry's relevance relative to the real world. That matters because regulatory systems assume future participation. They're designed with the expectation that tomorrow's market will look like today's market, just larger. When that assumption breaks, the system begins to decay. Data ages, addresses change, items are transferred, modified, or replaced. Meanwhile, new items enter circulation without ever touching the registry at all. Over time, this creates a widening gap between policy and reality. The law describes one universe. Actual ownership exists in another. This is why gun control advocates have historically fought so hard to preserve registration requirements even when enforcement is minimal. Registration isn't about immediate control, it's about future leverage. A registry built today becomes the foundation for tomorrow's policy proposals. Once growth stops, that foundation starts cracking. Consider how often modern gun control arguments rely on statistics tied to registered items. Lawmakers cite ownership numbers, compliance rates, and database figures to justify new restrictions. All of those arguments depend on the assumption that the data is representative. Once it's no longer representative, the argument collapses under its own weight. Courts notice this too. Judges are increasingly skeptical of regulations based on incomplete or unreliable datasets. When a registry captures only a minority of items, it becomes difficult to argue that it reflects a compelling governmental interest. Enforcement actions start to look arbitrary. Equal protection challenges become more viable. The state's burden of proof increases dramatically. This is why the phrase registry growth matters more than registry existence. A static registry is politically manageable. A shrinking registry is defensively useful. A growing registry is dangerous. Stopping growth also changes the incentives for future legislation. If lawmakers know that new items are not being automatically cataloged, they are far less likely to propose aggressive restrictions tied to ownership lists. The political risk increases. The chance of non-compliance rises, and the optics of enforcement worsen. This brings us to a point that is rarely discussed openly: compliance history. In nearly every modern attempt to retroactively regulate firearms or accessories, compliance has been far lower than projected. Whether it's state-level registration laws or feature bans, voluntary participation consistently falls short of expectations. Governments know this. That's why they prefer prospective registration systems that capture items at the point of sale. Once that opportunity is gone, it is extraordinarily difficult to recreate. Congress's decision effectively shuts that door. Any future attempt to rebuild Suppressor or SBR registration would require a completely new legislative effort, a new enforcement mechanism, and a new compliance strategy, all under far less favorable political conditions. There's also a generational effect at play. New gun owners entering the market today will experience ownership without automatic federal registration for these items. That changes norms. Expectations matter. Once people view an item as ordinary and unregistered, attempts to reverse that perception face steep resistance. What was once framed as exceptional becomes normal, and normal things are harder to regulate aggressively. This shift also complicates state-level efforts. While some states may attempt to create their own registries for suppressors and short-barreled rifles, fragmentation introduces its own problems. 50 different systems with different rules, fees, and enforcement priorities do not replicate the power of a single federal database. They create confusion, jurisdictional conflicts, and uneven compliance. That fragmentation benefits owners and manufacturers while increasing administrative costs for regulators. Another underappreciated consequence is market behavior. When buyers believe future regulation is uncertain but present ownership is stable, demand accelerates. This isn't speculation, it's observable behavior in nearly every regulated market. Firearms are no exception. Increased lawful ownership further dilutes the relative size of any existing registry, accelerating its loss of relevance. Critically, this also changes how advocacy organizations allocate resources. Instead of defending against a constantly expanding federal system, gun rights groups can focus on preventing reinstatement efforts. That is a fundamentally different fight, and one that history suggests is far easier to win. Opponents of the decision argue that stopping registry growth invites chaos or undermines public safety. But this claim depends on a premise that has never been convincingly demonstrated, that suppressor and SBR registries materially prevent crime. Available data does not support that conclusion. These items are rarely used in violent offenses, and when they are, registration status has little bearing on outcomes. What registries do provide is administrative convenience. They make policy easier to propose and enforcement easier to target. Removing that convenience doesn't remove law enforcement tools, it removes shortcuts. This distinction matters. Effective public safety policy relies on behavior, not databases. Registration systems track lawful owners, not criminals. By stopping registry growth, Congress has reduced the surveillance of compliant citizens without reducing penalties for actual misuse. And that's why this moment has broader implications beyond firearms policy. It signals a willingness, however limited, to question the assumption that more data always equals better governance. In an era defined by digital tracking and permanent records, choosing not to expand a database is itself a political act. The next phase of this debate won't be about taxes or paperwork. It will be about replacement strategies. When one tool loses effectiveness, policymakers look for another. That could mean shifting focus to manufacturers, distributors, or ancillary regulations. It could mean increased pressure at the state level, or it could mean renewed efforts to redefine categories entirely. With federal registry growth halted, attention inevitably shifts to what comes next. History makes one thing clear. When a centralized control mechanism loses effectiveness, it is rarely abandoned without a fight. Instead, it is replaced, rerouted, or fragmented into alternative systems designed to recover lost leverage. That reality shapes the next phase of this debate. The most immediate response will come from the states. Several states have already signaled that they intend to compensate for reduced federal oversight by strengthening or expanding their own regulatory frameworks. Some will attempt to create state-level registries for suppressors and short-barreled rifles. Others will pursue indirect methods, such as enhanced licensing requirements, additional transfer approvals, or expanded definitions that fold these items into broader categories of regulated firearms.
But state-level action faces structural limitations that federal systems do not. Fragmentation weakens enforcement. A registry that stops at a state border is inherently incomplete. Firearms ownership in the United States is mobile. People move. Items are transferred across jurisdictions. Manufacturers sell nationally. A patchwork of state databases cannot replicate the coverage or consistency of a single federal record system. This creates friction not just for gun owners, but for regulators themselves. Every additional layer of bureaucracy introduces cost, delay, and legal vulnerability. States attempting to replace federal oversight will have to defend their systems against constitutional challenges, preemption arguments, and practical enforcement failures. That's a far more complex undertaking than simply relying on an existing federal registry that grows quietly in the background. There's also the issue of political appetite. State-level registration efforts are highly visible. They require legislative debates, public hearings, and budget allocations. Unlike federal tax mechanisms that operate largely out of sight, state registries force lawmakers to take clear positions. That exposure carries risk, especially in swing states or regions where gun ownership is culturally normalized. At the same time, advocacy organizations opposed to suppressor and SBR deregulation face a strategic dilemma. Without automatic registry growth, long-term planning becomes more difficult. Proposals for buybacks, enhanced restrictions, or bans lose credibility when policymakers cannot confidently identify who owns what. Enforcement estimates become speculative, fiscal projections become uncertain, and public support weakens when compliance is assumed rather than demonstrated. This shifts the balance of debate from inevitability to persuasion. Instead of saying this is already tracked, advocates must argue for why tracking should be reinstated. That's a harder argument to make, especially as more people experience ownership without negative consequences. Another likely strategy is regulatory substitution. If direct registration is politically or legally blocked, regulators may look to adjacent controls: manufacturing standards, import restrictions, insurance requirements, zoning laws, or expanded definitions of prohibited configurations. These approaches don't rely on ownership lists, but they also don't offer the same precision. They're blunt instruments, and blunt instruments tend to produce backlash. Manufacturers and retailers will also play a role in shaping what comes next. When regulatory uncertainty decreases, investment increases. Product innovation accelerates, prices stabilize. As suppressors and SBRs become more common, their political treatment shifts. It becomes harder to portray them as rare or extreme when they are owned by millions of ordinary citizens for lawful purposes. This normalization effect is one of the most powerful forces in regulatory politics. Items that are widely owned are politically expensive to restrict. Every additional lawful owner represents not just a consumer, but a voter, a community member, and a potential advocate. By stopping registry growth, Congress has indirectly accelerated this normalization process. There's also a legal dimension that will become increasingly important over time. Courts evaluate firearms regulations using evidence, historical context, and proportionality. As registries become less complete and ownership becomes more widespread, the evidentiary basis for exceptional treatment weakens. Regulations that once appeared narrowly tailored begin to look overbroad or arbitrary. This doesn't mean challenges will disappear. It means the terrain has changed. Future battles will be fought over definitions, jurisdiction, and scope, rather than simple compliance metrics. That favors parties willing to engage at the legislative and judicial level, rather than relying on administrative inertia. One of the most underestimated consequences of this shift is how it affects future crises. Policy responses to high-profile events often rely on pre-existing tools. When a registry exists and is growing, it becomes an obvious lever to pull. When it does not, policymakers must either propose entirely new systems or pursue symbolic measures that offer little practical impact. Both options carry political cost. That reality doesn't eliminate the risk of reactionary legislation, but it constrains it. It invites debate. It exposes the trade-offs involved in expanding government power. Ultimately, what Congress has done is interrupt a feedback loop. For decades, suppressor and SBR regulation operated on a self-reinforcing cycle. More ownership led to more registration, which enabled more regulation, which justified more oversight. Breaking that cycle doesn't end the debate, but it prevents automatic escalation.
This moment will not be remembered for the tax itself. It will be remembered for what didn't happen quietly. A database did not grow. A system did not expand. A future assumption was disrupted. For gun owners, that represents a strategic win rather than a final victory. Wins like this don't eliminate opposition. They change incentives. They reshape timelines. They force new arguments to be made instead of old ones repeated. The conversation going forward will not be about whether suppressors and short-barreled rifles should be treated differently. It will be about whether exceptional regulation can be justified without exceptional data. And that is a far more difficult case to make. The growth of the tax registry has stopped. What replaces it, if anything, will define the next chapter of this debate. And that chapter will be written not by inertia, but by deliberate political choices on all sides. The automatic expansion era is over. From here on out, nothing moves forward without resistance, scrutiny, and consequence. And that alone changes everything.